If you ask me, there's really only one specific and very unlikely scenario that would lead to the New Orleans Saints taking a quarterback in the first round. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, New Orleans Saints expert, and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're taking a look at some unlikely draft scenarios for the New Orleans Saints. And we're also going to get to our midweek fundamentals. Yeah, we're back to some midweek fundamentals, teaching the game a little bit. So we're going to be discussing a little bit about how trade values are determined when it comes to draft picks. We're also going to take a look at whether or not the Saints could use some of their draft picks to potentially even trade up for a quarterback in round one. But first, then we're going to kick everything off with the one scenario in which the New Orleans Saints could potentially take a quarterback at 14. However unlikely that may be. So we're going to be breaking all of that down and much more on today's episode. I appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day here on Locked On Saints, and for being an everydayer as well here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. All right, so as we get started with today's show, the big thing that I want to look at is, yes, it is possible that the New Orleans Saints draft a quarterback in the first round of this year's draft. However, it is highly unlikely, and there's really only one scenario where it makes sense that doesn't get to a trade up. We'll get to trade up here in a little bit, but I want to start with just picking at 14. Would the New Orleans Saints take a quarterback? And there's one scenario in which this does happen. Now, I did answer this as a mailbag question last week. I'm coming back to it because I just wanted to dedicate more time to it, because I do think that it's an interesting conversation, because it gives us a couple of different questions that we'll try to answer here. First of all, why, right? That's the big thing we have to understand, is why would the Saints take a quarterback at 14? We'll get to that. We'll go into why they can't take a quarterback at 14. We'll dig into it. And then we'll discuss that one scenario upon whether something, actually, we can get straight to the one scenario in which something happens where the Saints could potentially take a quarterback at 14. And it's if one of the top four quarterbacks, which let's be very clear about who those are, keep it a buck. It's going to be Caleb Williams, Jayden Daniels, Drake Maye, JJ McCarthy. Those are your top four quarterbacks. Then there's a little bit of distance between them and Bo Nix and Michael Penix, okay? So with those top four quarterbacks, Williams, Daniels, Maye, McCarthy, nailed it. One of those four would have to have inexplicably fallen all the way down to 14. Let's explain why that's so difficult to believe, okay? First of which is that you've got several quarterback needy teams that are already drafting ahead of you. The Denver Broncos, a couple of picks ahead of you. The Las Vegas Raiders, right there. The entire top of the draft, the Chicago Bears, the Washington Commanders, the New England Patriots. You've got the Minnesota Vikings, who have 2 first-round picks at 11 as well as at 23. So they already select ahead of you, but there's a chance that they move up to pick 4, swapping out with the Arizona Cardinals. So then they end up taking a quarterback off the board. So there's a very good chance, and I think it's likely that we'll see 4 straight quarterbacks off the board, and that the draft won't really start this year until pick 5, when all of a sudden, you've got all the quarterbacks already off the board. So you've got the Bears at the top. You've got Washington. Bears take, let's say, Caleb Williams. Washington takes, I think they should take Jayden Daniels. And then Drake Maye goes to New England. And then you see a potential trade up at 4 for either the New York Giants trading up from 6, the Raiders trading up from 13, the Broncos don't really have the fodder to trade up from 12, but let's just say that it could be them. And then you also have the Minnesota Vikings, who are likely to trade up to 4, if not 2, to get their quarterback. So then JJ McCarthy, your 4th quarterback, is off the board. So that would be the one scenario is that somehow, some way, one of those 4 quarterbacks falls to 14. It's not unlikely that Bo Nix is there at 14. It's not unlikely at all that Michael Penix is there at 14. Those are the quarterbacks from Oregon and Washington, respectively. However, neither of them are likely to be selected by the New Orleans Saints at 14. Why? both of those players would be called luxury picks at 14. Those are not guys that are going to be coming in to be your starter right away. Now, I'm higher on Michael Penix than I think most people are. I was also higher on Hendon Hooker than most people were. See how right I have been about that. He hasn't even got the chance to see the field, so we don't know. But not top 15 high on him, right? Like the Saints, why would they draft a quarterback? You're drafting a quarterback to sit behind Derek Carr to maybe become your quarterback after that. Let's not try to confuse this for anything more than it is. Drafting a quarterback in the first round would be nothing more than a highly, highly expensive player to sit on your bench for a couple of years. It's not somebody that comes in and immediately competes with Derek Carr. No, that's not happening. It's not somebody comes in and is going to go jump ahead of Derek Carr. No, that's not happening. This organization wants Derek Carr to be its quarterback. These coaches want Derek Carr to be their quarterback. When they went out and they hired Clint Kubiak to become their offensive coordinator, they did so with Derek Carr in mind. Clint Kubiak is building this offense with Derek Carr very much in mind, right? So there's no confusion here. There's no dissenting. There's no, well, these people want this and these people want this. No, everyone involved wants Derek Carr as the quarterback. And that's one of the reasons why I picked Derek Carr as a breakout player for next year, a breakout player for the Saints in terms of his Saints tenure. He had a fine season last year, but he picked up a lot of momentum towards the end. That's usually indicative of something that could be much better next year. But then with a new offensive system coming in, all these other things. So here's the reason why I don't think that the Saints draft a quarterback at 14. The reason why they draft one is because they would be drafting him to sit behind Derek Carr for 2 years. The reason why they can't do that is because they're not a good enough team right now. They have too many needs. They need help on the offensive line. They need help on the defensive line. They need a new safety. They need, help at wide receiver. They tight end, you're not going to worry about in the first round. Linebacker, you're not going to worry about in the first round, especially in this draft. Tight end, you could worry about if you wanted to go the Brock Bowers route. But again, it's kind of the same as drafting a quarterback. That's somebody that's not really going to be ready for you unless he's not actually playing tight end, right? Unless you try to convert him to a Kyle Pitts type and everything like that, which might be perfect for Brock Bowers, actually. But outside of that, you need him to play an entirely different position in high school, in the NFL versus what he did in college. So it's challenging, right? You're probably not going to address that position in the first round, depending upon how in love with the team or how in love with Brock Bowers the team is. So you've got too much to worry about. And you can't take a luxury pick right now, which is what a quarterback would be, especially if you're taking a Bo Nix or a Michael Penix at 14, which would just be foolish. And so that's the way that I look at it. I don't think that we'll see the Saints do that. Can't say 0%. It can always happen for sure. And especially if one of those guys falls, one of those top 4 guys falls, like we saw Lamar Jackson fall years ago, then maybe something like that happens. But outside of that, I don't see the New Orleans Saints taking a quarterback at 14 with so much more talent out there, right? The tackle that you draft at 14 is going to be better than the quarterback after the top 4 at quarterback, right? Like you can get a better tackle playing tackle than you're going to get a better quarterback playing quarterback in that situation. So that's the way that I look at it. Now, trading up for a quarterback is something that we maybe shouldn't completely turn our nose up at. It's still the same thing to where you're spending a lot in order to just get somebody to sit around for a couple of years, and you're not a good enough team to do that right now. But if they're going to do it, there's one specific spot where they might be able to make it happen. Let's break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Game Time. There is simply no better place for you to be getting your tickets than with the Game Time app. They've got flash deals all the way up to the beginning of events, sometimes even an hour after an event starts, as people are trying to offload those tickets when they couldn't make it. You're able to find affordable pricing there, all-inclusive pricing as well, so you don't get the surprises. Basically, they're just giving you all the transparency, right? They're taking all of the guesswork out of buying tickets. And one of my favorite things is that you can actually see the view from your seat before you buy the ticket as well. So it's awesome whether you're planning moments in advance or months in advance. Game Time has you covered. So take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. That's terms apply. Again, create an account and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, family. If the New Orleans Saints are interested in trading up for a quarterback in this year's draft, they would have a hard time justifying it. Let's just be real. We appreciate you very much for being here for another episode of Making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, don't forget to go and check out Locked On Sports Today, the 24/7 national sports stream over on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today, the first of its kind on YouTube. You can also find it over on the free Amazon TV channels app as well. Get all the insight from the local experts that know their teams the best. It's a great way to keep up with everything going on around the NCAA championship tournament, and of course the beginning of the MLB season as well. So go and check it out today. Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or on that free Amazon Fire TV channels app. So look, if the New Orleans Saints decide that they want to trade up for a quarterback, they could technically get it done. There's one big old obstacle, first of all, and that would be the Minnesota Vikings. And really, there's two big old obstacles. First of which is that they'll have a hard time justifying the expense. And I'll explain what the expense is here in just a moment as a part of that. The other bit of it, though, is simply that the competition that they would have to move up for a quarterback doesn't feel like it would be very worth it for the team in terms of what they're getting a quarterback for. Let's remember that the idea of getting a quarterback in the first round for the New Orleans Saints in particular would be to sit them. Wait, not somebody that's going to come in and be your franchise quarterback starter right away, not somebody that's even guaranteed to ever become your franchise quarterback. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of what the asking price is. And this is a team that hasn't drafted a quarterback in the first round since Archie Manning. And then in the supplemental draft one time, they spent the first round pick on a quarterback. Like this is just isn't what this team does. So they'd have a hard time justifying this. So let's discuss what the sweet spot would be for them to move up. So the sweet spot for them, if they want to move up to get one of the top four quarterbacks, would likely mean that they have to move up to the fourth pick with the Arizona Cardinals. Now, if for whatever reason, the New England Patriots shock the world and don't take a quarterback, you got everybody and their mama calling the Arizona Cardinals to try to move up. But the thing about that is that if everything would change if New England doesn't take a quarterback, because you would see two quarterbacks go off the top, right? Let's say that Caleb Williams, and let's just throw a curveball in there, and let's say that Drake Maye goes number 2 overall, or even something crazy happens, right? There was a lot of conversation at the owners' meetings about the potential of JJ McCarthy going number 2 overall to the Washington Commanders on some real Zach Wilson energy, on some real Mitch Trubisky energy type moments, things like that. Passing the guys that are proven talents for the guy that just had a really nice pro day and everything. And that's me being disrespectful, if I'm being honest. I actually like JJ McCarthy as a quarterback, but this just feels like those moments that we've seen in the past. The number 2 overall pick at quarterback, historically over recent past hasn't gone well, but maybe CJ Stroud last year changed the course of that, and the Washington Commanders could benefit off of that going into this year. So let's say that they shock the world and take JJ McCarthy at number 2. If for whatever reason New England Patriots didn't take Jayden Daniels, if for whatever reason New England Patriots didn't take Drake Maye, and they took Marvin Harrison Jr. and they're ready to roll ahead with who they bring in as their bridge quarterback, was it Brissett? And so let's say that they would just randomly do that. Then all of a sudden, trading up at 4 isn't your only option. So you let the Minnesota Vikings and their 2 first-round picks trade up at 4, but then you make a phone call to the Los Angeles Chargers and say, hey, we want to move for, we'll give you, it's going to cost you a lot, because you're always going to pay a premium, right? We're going to be taking a look at draft values and how they're determined in the Rich Hill trade chart and all these other things, which isn't the specific chart that the NFL uses. They have their own chart, but this is a good replicator of it. You can throw it out the window though, because you're going to be charged a premium to move up for a quarterback. And especially when you have, in this scenario where New England shocks the world and doesn't take a quarterback, if Minnesota is trading their 2 first-round picks in 2023, which are 11 and 23 overall, and then their 2024 first or 2025 first, and let's say they also move their 2020. So you're talking 4 first-round picks to move up to 4. You're not beating that if you're the New Orleans Saints, right? You don't have the fodder to beat it. You'll never beat it. You're not going to beat it. But can you get up to 5 with the Los Angeles Chargers with this year, next year, and the year after that's first round picks? Because it's probably what you're going to have to pay. The team that just moved up to the pick before you, before the Chargers, just gave up 4 first round picks. The team moving up 1 pick after that is going to have to give up a haul. Now, it's worth it if that's somehow, let's say the Minnesota Vikings move up like that, and then they took, in this scenario, Drake Maye, and all of a sudden Jayden Daniels is somehow there at 5. You trade up to that, but now are we just getting ridiculous at this point? So that's one of the reasons why I kind of sit back and I say, it would take a lot to justify. You would have to have the surprise non-QB pick at 3, let the big trade up happen at 4, and then you move up for less at 5 to get somehow the better quarterback. That's the only way that you can justify it, right? Like there's no other way to justify it. Now, if you somehow find a way to move up to 4 in place of the Minnesota Vikings, then maybe you're in conversation there, but that's going to be really hard. And you're not going to get New England more than likely. I mean, New England, I guess maybe you could get them up out of 3, but again, you have to compete with the team that can give up 4 first round picks to get that done in the Minnesota Vikings. It just doesn't seem likely that the opportunity is going to be there. So then if you end up saying, okay, well, what if the top 4 quarterbacks are off the board, but the Saints really like Bo Nix and they decide that they need to get up ahead of Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos at 12 to move up for Bo Nix, make that trade? You are never going to be able to justify that. You're just not going to be able to justify that. You're going to be able to justify it to the draft nerds that kind of go like, oh, well, they traded up for a quarterback. At least they're taking swings at quarterback and all these other things. Sure, you might be able to justify it there. But outside of that, depending upon the price that you paid to get that done, it's going to be a little bit hard to convince people. Because what you could see happen is the Arizona Cardinals trade back from 4 to 11 in 23 with the Minnesota Vikings, and then the Saints trade up from 14 up to 11 with the Arizona Cardinals, who trade back to get even more draft fodder. That would actually be pretty smart by the Arizona Cardinals in that situation. Now, if I were them, I'd be taking those phone calls from Denver at 12, make them move up 1 spot to make sure Las Vegas doesn't move up 2 to jump them for a quarterback, or to make sure that New Orleans doesn't move up 3 to jump them for a quarterback, whatever. I would be calling up Denver and being like, we're getting a lot of phone calls about people trying to jump up for Bo Nix, and I would be trying to get Denver to move up 1 spot, right? That's what I would be trying to do if I were the Arizona Cardinals in that situation. But if the Saints were to do that, and then they moved up to 12 to 11 to take Bo Nix, or moved up to 11 to take Michael Penix Jr., you're not going to be able to justify that. You can justify that with Jayden Daniels. You can justify that with Drake Maye. You might be able to justify that with J.J. McCarthy. We're not even going to talk about Caleb Williams in this equation because that ain't happening. But the Saints would have a really, really tough time justifying effectively anything other than a move for Jayden Daniels. That would kind of be it. And the moves for Jayden Daniels require him to fall. Require him to fall to 5. Require him to fall to 5. Like that would be the sweet spot where the Saints can go, boom, we can make a move there, go and get the quarterback. Then you've justified it because you've got a guy that is in the argument for being the best quarterback in this year's class. Like Caleb Williams is Caleb Williams, but there's a lot of people who also really, really like Jayden Daniels. And so if nothing else, you've gotten the second best quarterback in this year's draft at the 5th selection. Yeah, you can make that move. That's the one place where I think you'd be able to justify it. And some people would still have problems with it, but I think you'd still be able to justify that a lot easier than a move up to 2, or where you're trying to convince a quarterback needy team to not take a quarterback and move back, or taking one of the 5th or 6th guys at 14 or moving up. It doesn't make sense. So that's my thought. That's where I think it does make sense, and the one way that you can actually justify it. Coming up next, let's discuss a little bit more about trade values, how they're decided, and how those values impact draft day trades or draft pick trades. Let's get to that as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. You can make every moment more with FanDuel today and every day, because FanDuel is doing everything, giving you everything to make sure that you can be excited about getting in on all of the sports action that's out there. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets by winning their first $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use on the NCAA tournament, women's and men's, MLB, NBA, NHL. There's even some NFL draft props and so much more that you can get in on as well. I love using FanDuel, and it's always a ton of fun. I didn't get to walk away with the winnings that I wanted when it came to the LSU Iowa game, but hey, now you can follow Iowa all the way there. South Carolina is a super heavy favorite going up against North Carolina State, 11.5-point favorite. It's a really good destination for your first $5 bet, so you can get those 40-1 odds on the immediate $200 in bonus bets. So a little tip for you there. Go and check them out today at FanDuel.com/locked-on and make your first big move a big win. All right, family. The NFL has an interesting way of kind of creating value around draft picks. And there's even a way to measure around whether or not a draft pick trade is fair using numbers, value, all these other things. So let's break all that down as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, getting into our midweek fundamentals. Every Wednesday, we're going to do this. We're going to deep dive into something that isn't necessarily, that impacts the New Orleans Saints for sure, but isn't necessarily, it might be more about, here's how you can tell man coverage versus zone coverage. Here's how you can tell gap versus run scheme. Here's each of the techniques on the defensive line. Here's the different double teams you can use on an offensive line, things like that. Just things to kind of dig a little bit deeper and kind of teach the fundamentals around football as well. So really excited to get into that. We'll do this every Wednesday. And then coming up in tomorrow's episode, as it's Thursday, we're going to do a little bit of a Thursday deep dive as well. I want to dive a little bit deeper into this New Orleans Saints wide receiver room as it stands right now, and what specifically is left to be added from a statistics numerical play style standpoint, not just what the style of the receiver is, but what it is that we're looking for. So we're going to dive into that in tomorrow's episode. But right now, let's take a look at what the trade values are around the NFL. So if you head over to a website like it's drafttech.com, you'll be able to find through that website some of the draft value trade charts. And there's a couple different versions. There's the Jimmy Johnson version. There's the Rich Hill model. I personally like the Rich Hill model. It's just smaller numbers, so it just makes it a little bit easier for dumb people like me to be able to understand it. So I wanted to take a look at that value or that value chart, what each pick what each of the Saints picks is valued at, what their total number of values are, and how easy it would be for them to be able to mobilize, move around, things like that. And some of the places that are most often discussed as a potential for movement. So in looking at in considering the draft pick value here, what we know is that the Saints stand with a total of 507 points for their 9 selections in this year's draft. Earlier selections are weighted much higher than later selections, of course. So the Saints' first round selection at 14 is listed as with a pick value or with a trade value of 325 points, 325. Okay. Just to kind of give you an idea of what that is in comparison to Chicago's number 1 overall selection sits with 1,000 points in this case. And then it goes down to 717 for the number 2 overall selection, so on and so forth. And I say so on and so forth just as a thing, not really as like there's a system there. There's not. But this is what the value is. So Chicago at number 1, 1,000 points. Washington at number 2, 717 points. New England at number 3, 514 points. And then it just trickles all the way down until you get down to New Orleans at 14 at 325 points. In the second round, their 45th overall selection brings in 131 points. So if the Saints were to package their first round selection at 14 and their second round selection at 45, that would end up turning the combined value of those two picks, 325 and 131, into 456 points. With 456 points, there's the potential that they can move up to number 6 between those two selections with the New York Giants, whose 6th round selection sits with 446 points, so 10 points less. So that's the idea around how to combine picks and then move up to a pick that maybe is of the same value or is of similar value or whatever, in order to be able to like figure out the fairness of a trade. So there's 2 ways that you can look at that. You could look at the New York Giants draft pick at 6, 446, and say, okay, what do I need to trade to get that? Or you can combine the value of some picks and say, okay, if I combine this and this, then how would I be able to move up to that? The tricky part is to kind of go back to a point that I had made earlier, is that the value of a trade up will be impacted by what position and what players are on the board. You're going to pay a premium if you're clearly moving up for a quarterback. You're going to pay a premium moving up into the top 10 if you're trading from outside the top 10. You're going to pay a premium if you're moving up into the top 5 if you draft outside the top 5, an even higher premium if you draft outside the top 10, outside the top 15, all of that. So it won't always simply be this pick plus that pick will get you this pick, because sometimes there's other context that has to be incorporated and has to be evaluated as well. Does that make sense? So you end up in a situation where it's like, yeah, you could use this pick and this pick value-wise, move up to this pick, but quarterbacks are on the board here, and one of the top 3 quarterbacks is on the board here, so you're going to have to pay up a little bit more, right? You're going to have to pay that extra. That's why you end up seeing trades that maybe a team moving from 11 to 16 to 6 or 11 to 5 or 11 to 4 could potentially say, oh, I could do that with my first and second round picks, but you see them trading future first instead, because that's the way that all kind of works. And just to give you an idea of how like future firsts work and everything, or future picks work, the draft pick or the round of that pick is value, or how do I say this? The value of a future pick is based upon the one round later in this year. Let me see if I can explain a little bit better. So the Saints at pick 114, right? If they were to trade next year's first round pick, you look at what the 14th selection of the second round in this year's draft is valued, and that's the value of a future first. If you're trading a future second, you look at the value of that same selection, but in the third round. So from like 1 through 32 or whatever, compensatory picks obviously are different, but if it's the 14th pick of the second round in next year's draft projected, then you're looking at the 14th pick of this year's draft to find its valuation. So a future first for the New Orleans Saints in 2025, when trading in 2024, carries the value of like 128 points, basically is what you're looking at, which is effectively the 14th selection in the second round of this year's draft. So that's the way that is valued. So the next thing is, what could the Saints get if they traded back? And that can become a little bit of a tougher conversation because there's so many different options and so many different potential things that could happen there. But with the Saints having at 14 a value of 325, they could move back in the first round and still pick up a second round selection. San Francisco's 31st overall and 63rd overall equal just over 270 points. So you could probably move back to 31, get 63, and maybe even get 94 out of San Francisco before everything really values up in terms of them moving up all the way to the 4th round. So that way, to the 14th overall selection. So that would give you a later first round pick, another second round pick, and a third round pick, kind of in fairness, right? They're not moving up for a quarterback, so you're probably not charging a premium. Them moving from 31 up to the top 15 of the draft, you could probably charge a little bit of a premium there, so you might be able to get even more, a little bit more there and things like that. And then the other thing that's really popular is the Saints trading some of their 5th round selections. So if you're looking at trading, so pick 150 has a value of 12, pick 170 has a value of 9, that's a value of 21 in total. So that would allow the Saints to move up from 150 and 170 to like San Francisco's 124 or Houston's 123, which are both valued at 21 points. So that's kind of the way that this all works out. Again, there's nuances and things like that in between, but that's the basics of how like a trade value chart works. And the NFL doesn't use specifically the Rich Hill trade value chart, but they all effectively have an understanding of what the value of a pick is. And all the GMs have kind of agreed on what that is, and they utilize that as a part of things. So same principle, but maybe just different numbering system, different chart, whatever it might be. So as you look, that's how it works. So we'll do more of that. That one was a little bit more numbers heavy. Other stuff we'll get into like scheme stuff and all that other stuff, but this is just felt like a good time to kind of explain a little bit about that and get started with our midweek fundamental segment, which we'll do every Wednesday. I will see you tomorrow. Of course, we appreciate you very much as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pels and Locked On LSU for your second listen today. And in the meanwhile, we appreciate you very much. As always, make it Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.